welcome back to the House Huddle. Just a quick refresher on this particular series. These videos will be chapter readings directly from the hard copy book that I purchased, as well as my objective opinion of each chapter. Some will be more in detail than others, but it really just depends on how much I find it's relevant to the case. In this episode, I wanted to connect with those of you who show your support and objective views in the comments as well. Now keep in mind, these do not have to be views that align with myself particularly. However, I really do appreciate the ability to remain objective even when we disagree. So I'll go over a few of those comments and I'll give a quick recap of the first chapter, then we'll jump right into chapter 2. Chapter 1 introduced us to the overall concept of Babywise and where it originated. Someone in the comments clearly had not watched the video and mentioned, quote unquote, one doctor's opinion, end quote. And frankly, that just wasn't the case. I read through multiple physician statements supporting the method. Again, you certainly do not have to choose to follow Babywise. I did not follow it with either one of my children. However, I do ask that you keep your comments respectful and of the stance that sometimes someone may be trying to learn something new and helpful, not someone blaring their opinion on a subject that clearly was not researched prior to commenting. I always welcome opposing views and opinions. However, those made in poor taste will not be highlighted. For privacy reasons, I did opt to black out the names of the subscribers of the featured comments. However, they are posted publicly as well. I do ask that you please remain respectful should you have any further comments that you wish to share. The first comment that caught my attention mentioned the following. She said, "It kills me to hear any parenting book written before laptops, cell phones, the changing dynamics of women in the workforce, and cost of living. If sleeping were so important, then skip parenting. If it's a season you don't want to deal with, then it's very easy not to." And that latter part, I have to agree. If you do not recognize that there will be changes, big changes to your schedules, and especially sleep, even with a baby who sleeps through the night, there isn't really anyone or any way to prepare you for that first season of infancy, or quite frankly, even just the drive home from the hospital. Think about it. You drive into the hospital in one fashion, but it's definitely not the same when you leave that hospital for the first time with a newborn baby in the back seat. I remember my oldest son, Camden, when it was time to bring him home from the hospital. It was a cold December day, and I had my mom go downstairs and crank up the heat, like 30 minutes before we were set to leave. And I remember I very carefully fastened his seatbelt in his car seat and made sure he was all strapped in, double checked and triple checked the straps. My mother's account would probably be a little more animated as I backseat drove her all the way home, and this was like a 45-minute drive of me sitting in the backseat going or saying things like, "Slow down, Mama, don't turn that sharp." And it's a sweet memory now that I have with her, and I miss her dearly, but the level of anxiety and cautiousness that is present when a baby is in the picture, it changes you on the deepest of levels. So I 100% agree. If you aren't ready for your life to change, then it may not be the right time to have a baby. Eventually, you overcome the anxiety and newness, but it's the same with sleep. You're not going to be sleeping as soundly and without interruption as you would outside the presence of your baby. It's also why I think those parenting classes with crying, lifelike baby dolls should be implemented in high schools across the country. A 3 to 7 day sleep deprived, you still have to fully function and still be fully responsible for all of your grades and the rest of your classes, yet you still have to wake up, feed, and tend to a baby. That would be quite the eye-opener for young people. The earlier part of the comment refers to the book as a whole, and I'm not quite there to give my full opinion on the Babywise method. I still feel like I'm learning more about this method. And keep in mind, I'm literally reading this book for the first time as I'm recording the narration for these videos. And you guys would laugh at my number of outtakes because I stumble on some of these words or get tongue-tied, so I have to stop and then edit and things like that. And it's quite comical sometimes, but I will surely give my overall opinion of the book the further we move along. I don't believe as of now that it's outdated. Even with the changes in technology and the culture of women in the workplace, I do think if you reflect back to the 80s and 90s, there was a huge shift in technology as well as women began speaking out about and, speaking up about their rights, demanding more, hence, cutting their hair short, because if they wanted to cut their hair short, it somehow, gave them a sense of power and individuality. And, just the complete revolution of the American housewife. The book was developed with those factors in mind. Now, I don't think anyone could have imagined how technology was going to take on a life of its own, but technology is a distraction that sacrifices time and presence with those that we love. Take all of the social media off your phone for 30 days. The amount of time you actually interact with those close to you during those 30 days is more often than not exponentially more than when you're plugged into the apps and social platforms. So the question really becomes, is the book outdated or did the priorities shift? If we are being honest with ourselves, then maybe the problem doesn't lie with technology or work schedule demands, more so our lack of discipline and priorities. The line between what we want and need is blurred so much in today's society that sometimes getting back to the basics is really the best way to preserve the innocence of life in general. You don't need a cell phone. You don't need cable or social media, another photo. What is needed is time and attention on your family and a schedule. If you schedule your life accordingly, then less and less get cut, yet you're able to better be present with each event, memory, or moment. Allocating time to be focused is key. These are just my thoughts, respectfully, of the book so far. And thoughts after reading this comment, I want to say I appreciate the comment and definitely appreciate you sharing your thoughts. So as I read, my opinions may change. They may not, but I encourage you to feel comfortable sharing your thoughts and opinions along the way. I really enjoy reading them and especially challenging my own perspectives as well. Guys, that's how we grow. One commenter mentioned being a single mom, divorced mom, and married mom who stated that when she was remarried, she made it abundantly clear to her new husband that she and her children were a package, which I 100% agree. But then she states that she told her husband her kids would always come first. And I do not disagree with this in the context of protecting the children, and they should always come first to anyone's ego. But it's such a controversial topic to discuss, and I'm open to doing so. However, to stay focused on getting through this book, I don't want to unpack all of those thoughts here at this time. Hopefully, as we have these conversations, and if you're feeling triggered, please know that as a social sister, I'm over here and I do pray for you. I pray for my subscribers because, I understand and recognize that we're all human beings behind the keyboard with the exception of a few BOTS. And just know that I've had to endure, survive, and heal from my own share of difficult circumstances and traumas. So I've had to navigate through things and learn to move forward. So when I share these thoughts and opinions, I didn't just reach them overnight without years of walking through fires on my own or learning hard lessons. But it's also why some of those opinions are firm for me and where I stand personally. Like, some of them are very solid personal convictions that I've come to, but it definitely did not originate overnight. That's not to say that where you are in your journey doesn't shape your current position as well. So respectfully, I welcome the differences and just ask that you acknowledge that for myself, it has taken years of growth, maturity, and forgiveness for others as well as myself, more often than not, just simply being young and being a human being. I hope that no matter where you are on your parenting journey, albeit a new parent, researching your options, a seasoned parent, or even grandparents, I hope that you give others the same grace that you do yourself, and then some. Chapter 2, Feeding Philosophies. One day, sitting by a peaceful pond, I found myself amused by 3 children, their tiny feet scampering back and forth as they pursue the perfect skipping stone. Who as a child has not, at one time or another, tried to skip a stone across the smooth surface of a lake or dropped a pebble in a pool of water and then watched as perfect concentric circles expand outward from the center? The weight of the pebble breaking the surface creates energy that causes an expansion of ripples. But the initial source that brought this energy to life was the decision to drop the pebble into the water in the first place. There's a parenting principle tied to this metaphor. Every decision made and every action taken as a result of our personal beliefs and assumptions sets in motion rippling effects of corresponding outcomes. Those outcomes are tied to the nature of our beliefs. We will definitely be coming back to that. Our actions affect not only the seen but also the unseen, often producing unintended consequences. The stone hitting the water, for example, could scare baby turtles floating near the surface, driving them into deep water, possibly toward a predator. The sound of the splash might startle some water birds and cause them to take flight, leaving behind a familiar habitat that provides food and safety. If these collateral actions take place, they are all connected back to us because of a single momentary decision to throw a pebble in the first place. You would think that establishing good feeding habits would be the easiest part of infant care, since a newborn's drive to satisfy hunger is one of the strongest in life. On the surface, it all sounds fairly simple. Baby is hungry, so you feed him. What more do you need to know? Unfortunately, it's not that clear-cut. When it comes to babies, the ripple effect principle is clearly evident in something as basic as how and when to feed a baby. As we will demonstrate in this and other chapters, the feeding philosophy a mother and father decide to implement will produce an ever-expanding series of ripples that impact every aspect of the baby's life. Every parenting philosophy has its own pathology and will take parents into different directions to different outcomes. Every feeding philosophy brings with it a different set of parenting priorities and opinions about what is best for a baby. Although there is no consensus about what best means or how it is achieved, that is because each parenting priority is driven by large worldviews and beliefs about children, their origin, nature, and basic needs. Different priorities inevitably lead parents to different strategies of care and correspondingly to different outcomes. Unfortunately, as the goals and priorities of each philosophy are presented, they all sound noble and persuasive, but the outcomes are not equal. The more parents understand each feeding philosophy, better prepared they will be to make an informed decision for their baby's benefit. Let's examine 3 most prominent feeding philosophies in our society and find out what they can teach us about today's parenting theories. The evolution of feeding philosophies. Prior to the rise of early childhood theories in the 20th century, common sense guided parents with sound thinking, producing predictable outcomes. Mothers nursed their babies based on hunger cues, but also in sync with mom's daily household duties. Routine was very much a part of her day, and routine feedings were a part of her baby's life. Today, there is not only a variety of feeding philosophies for parents to navigate through, but each philosophy has its own lingo. For example, during pregnancy, you may have been encouraged to demand feed your baby or warned not to follow a schedule, especially if you intend to breastfeed. Maybe you heard about a demand schedule or self-regulating schedule. Perhaps you were encouraged to consider natural feeding while avoiding hyperscheduling. Of course, hyperscheduling is rigid, and rigid feeding is not as good as cry feeding. But the latter is less desirable than cue feeding, which is similar to responsive feeding. And last but not least is bottle feeding. Where in the world does this fit in? Let's see if we can make some sense of all these titles by stepping back to the last century and examining the origin of today's feeding philosophies. I don't know about you, but that was one too many ways to feed a baby. Philosophy of behaviorism, clock feeding. While the 19th century witnessed a surge in child development theories, it was not until the 20th century that 2 competing schools of thought captured the public's attention. The first was the behavioral school, emerging in the early 1900s. Behaviorists emphasized environmental stimuli as the primary influence on human behavior. At the same time, they downplayed the influence on internal factors such as emotions, human will, and human nature. They believed that if you could control the environmental influences, you could engineer the perfect child. Behaviorism received an unintentional boost with the growing women's movement of the 1920s, which was symbolized by short hair, short skirts, contraceptives, cigarettes, and bottle feeding replacing breastfeeding. The latter became possible because of the discovery of an algebraic equation called baby formula. Since quote-unquote formula could be offered any time, a new feeding practice emerged called schedule feeding or clock feeding. I never knew that. I never even knew why we called it formula, but that's pretty cool that it was an algebraic formula that ultimately gave baby formula its name. A regimented feeding schedule of every 4 hours was considered to be in the best interest of the child, and every quote-unquote good mother was expected to follow it to the minute. The baby who showed signs of hunger sooner than 4 hours was left to quote-unquote cry it out because the clock, not the baby, determined when feedings occurred with little regard to the baby's immediate needs or the parent's natural inclination to intervene. The philosophy of neo-primitivism, child-led feeding. By the mid-1940s, a second theory and adaptation of Sigmund Freud's views started to nudge the rigidity of behaviorism from center stage. Excuse me, guys. A small group of Freud's 20th century followers put forth the idea that children are born psychologically damaged as a result of the birthing process. Working within the void of limited science of the day, it was speculated that labor and delivery was so traumatizing to the unborn child that birthing became the wellspring of all future mental imbalances and insecurities. That's pretty interesting. Otto Rank was the Austrian psychoanalyst credited as the first champion of the birth trauma view, dated back to 1929. While his theory did not catch on right away, it eventually inspired the neo-primitivistic school of child development, supported by Ribble, Aldrich, Frank, and Trainheim. Pilifion, goodness, these names. Pilifion and Kraft, 1945. The title, Neo-Primitivistic, is not name-calling, but reflects a specific school of thought that postulates that separation at birth disrupts the in utero relational harmony between mother and child. Therefore, the primary goal of early parenting is to reestablish or reattach the baby, emotionally speaking. That's really interesting in that it's dated all the way back to 1945, but even recently, and I say recently, probably in the last 8 to 10 years maybe, was when we started seeing this resurgence of skin-to-skin contact. I don't know if any new mothers or recent mothers remember this, but I know working on the mom-baby unit in our local hospital, we completely did away with the nursery because it was all about putting the baby right up against mom. So it's just interesting to hear that these theories were around in 1945, and even in the hospitals today, we still practice very much skin to skin and keeping the baby close to mom. I just had never heard this side of it as far as the theory or the thought process being reconnecting the baby to mom emotionally. The theory works from a bizarre twofold assumption that babies in the womb have a perfect quote-unquote emotional relationship with their mothers, but lose emotional attachment during the birthing process. This leads to a second assumption, that every newborn has a lingering subconscious desire to return to the security of his mother's womb. Since that cannot happen physically, the mother is to create and mimic an artificial womb-like environment and maintain it long after birth. All of her efforts are aimed at reversing the psychic shock brought on by the trauma of birth. Now, just in reading this, something that it makes me think of, because now in medicine, like in my medical career now, I left pediatrics a few years ago, and went back to geriatrics. And I can tell you, being at the bedside when an elderly person passes, it's really interesting because 9 times out of 10, they will return to the fetal position if allowed. So, like, if they can still move about in the bed how they wish to be, they are typically most comfortable in a fetal position. And it's just interesting that that's how you're created, that's how you live the first 9 months that you're developing, and then towards the end of life to see that your body naturally wants to return back to that state. From this theory came very specific reattachment protocols. The process of reattaching the baby emotionally requires the day and night presence and availability of the mother, who is urged to return to a primitive style of nurturing. The baby should be endlessly cradled, sleep with the mother, be breastfed well into the 2nd or 3rd year. The child is to be the center of the family universe where all practices minister to his comfort and minimize his anxiety. By 1949, the birth trauma theory, lacking objective, verifiable data, was dismissed with considerable skepticism. Around the same time, the school of behaviorism, while still strong, was beginning to lose influence, in part due to an up-and-coming pediatrician whose first book sold 50 million copies in the span of his life. His name was Dr. Benjamin Spock. His book was Baby and Child Care, by today's standards. Dr. Spock was a centrist and best known for advocating common-sense parenting while stressing that babies are individuals better served with a flexible routine than a fixed schedule. He rejected behavioristic one-size-fits-all dictates on everything from the strict feeding schedules to potty training, but also dismissed the child-centered extremes of neo-primitivism, which rejected all aspects of structure and routine. By the 1980s, however, Dr. Spock's centrist influence began to erode because of social conservatives, who thought his views were too permissive, and social liberals who declared his parenting advice too controlling. With the polarization of Spock's views and the decline of his popularity, there came a resurgence of birth trauma theory. While the foundational tenets of the 1940s birth trauma theory did not change, the modern version took on a new name. Today, it is referred to as attachment parenting, which in truth has very little connection to the theories of infant attachment. They are linked in name only, not by science. It is important to note the distinctions here. The theory of infant attachment is the accepted belief that physical touch is a significant necessary. Excuse me, guys. The theory of infant attachment is the accepted belief that physical touch is a significant necessity of survival. As authors, we believe that human touch is a baby's first language, communicating love and security through the portal of the senses. Touch is as important as proper nutrition, and the lack of either will lead to failure to thrive. I'm kind of tucking that little nugget away for later. Parents should minister to the actual needs and vulnerabilities of their babies. However, they should be cautious of any parenting theory that creates extreme or false vulnerabilities. That is when healthy protection turns into unhealthy overprotection to the long-term detriment of the child. Attachment parenting advocates of the 1980s may have hijacked the name, but they substituted an old, discarded theory for actual science behind true infant-parent attachment. This is why adherents of attachment parenting elevate nursing beyond the nutritive value of breast milk. It is also why a mother can never breastfeed too much, too long, or too often, but only too little. Even if it is in the third feeding in 30 minutes, the attachment parenting mom is acting on the fearful assumption that every cry, if not a signal of hunger, is a potential sign of attachment failure. It all becomes a vicious cycle. Sad to say, the recommended attachment parenting protocols require to manufacture a quote-unquote secure attached child too often produce the opposite, an emotionally stressed, high-need, insecure baby in one mom One mom tired. I may or may not be a one mom tired. What about you? So, creating the bogeyman. After more than 60 years of speculation behind the theory, there has been no conclusive evidence provided or a convincing body of research offered that supports the birth trauma premise on which the modern attachment parenting philosophy is based. Meanwhile, the science refuting it continues to grow, especially in light of one fact of nature. There is no life form on Earth, simple or complex, human or animal, in which the offspring spontaneously seeks to retreat to the past in search of an old attachment. Unfortunately, as long as the birthing process is marketed as a bogeyman that inflicts trauma on helpless babies, the attachment parenting remedy will always have willful adherence. However, is the womb really a paradise to which the newborn seeks to return? In order to justify the extreme tenets of attachment parenting in this modern age of science, proponents continue to present new and unsuspecting parents the birthing process in horrific, distressing language. They assign to the helpless infant feelings of parental abandonment and betrayal that must be overcome if true attachment is to take place. In the scientific world, this is known as apophenia, attempting to make a connection where no connections exist. I like that word. A baby, they say, is born fully conscious of a traumatic upheaval brought on during birthing, in which he is forcibly thrust from the warmth, protection, and security of the womb, totally exposed to a new world. In this new world, he must exert effort to obtain food, draw on his breath, and gasp, cough, and struggle to survive. Really? Does the birthing process actually do all that? How about a more accurate, rational, life-giving perspective that acknowledges that it is only because of the birthing process that a baby is truly liberated from a condition of incredible restraint? A baby in the womb is unable to express himself or communicate even the most basic needs. He lived in a world of darkness, in a confined sac where the nutrients that supported life began to mix with his body fluids. It was a place where touch was not permitted, nor was there the opportunity to hear the voices of love, care, and protection. A baby is saved only by the miracle and beauty of the birthing process that truly delivers him from bondage to freedom, where he can participate in the wide range of human sensations. For the first time, he is able to experience the touch of a loving mother and father, and to hear the sounds of their voices as well as the beauty of the songbird. He is able to experience 1,000 different rays of color carried on light beams that the womb prevented him from seeing previously. He is free to laugh, move freely, and discover a world previously closed off to him. All this is made possible by the single passageway carried on the wings of the birthing process. If birth is actually a moment to remember, then it is a moment to celebrate, not one to return to restraint and bondage. Finally, if trauma is attached to the memory of birthing, by what neurologic function is this achieved? Here's the fact to consider. Newborns have zero memory of birth, let alone the ability to recall anxiety that is specific to that experience. Memory function and synapse development depend on the brain receiving highly oxygenated blood, which comes from breathing. Breathing cannot begin until the lungs inflate, which occurs after, not during the birth process. Higher brain centers that control memory are still developing at the time of birth and afterwards. Thus, where do the facts lead? While behaviorists emphasize outward structure and not the inner person, the neo-primitivists emphasize the inner person as at the expense of the outward structure. We believe both approaches are extreme and detrimental to healthy parenting outcomes. There is a better way, and it is found in the center. So this next section is the Babywise alternative, parent-directed feeding. While some mothers thrive emotionally on attachment-style parenting, that is not the case for most women. A more user-friendly, less fatiguing methodology is called parent-directed feeding, or PDF. It's an infant management strategy that helps mothers to connect with their babies and babies to connect with everyone in the family. PDF is the center point between hyperscheduling and the reattachment theories. It has enough structure to bring security and order to the baby's world, yet enough flexibility to give mom the freedom to respond to any need at any time. It is a proactive style of parenting that helps foster healthy growth and optimal development. For example, a baby cannot maximize learning without experiencing optimal alertness, and you can only experience optimal alertness with optimal sleep. Optimal sleep is tied to good naps and established nighttime sleep. These advanced levels of sleep are the end result of consistent feedings. Consistent feedings come from establishing a healthy routine. So PDF is the pebble that creates the ripple effect leading to all these outcomes, including a true parent-child attachment. Embedded in the parent-directed strategy is a critical element for all aspects of infant care: parental assessment, an acquired confidence to think, evaluate, and intuitively learn what a baby needs and how to meet specific needs at specific times. What are the advantages of parent-direct approach? The following comparative analysis of the 3 common feeding philosophies answers that question and more. Comparative analysis of feeding philosophies. The 3 prominent feeding philosophies include child-led feeding, also known as cue feeding, demand feeding, response feeding, ad-lib, and self-regulating feeding. Clock feeding, also known as fixed scheduling, and Babywise parent-directed feeding, PDF. Who knew there was this much of a background on 10 different styles of feeding a baby? The more you know. Theories and practice. Child-led feeding. Feeding times are guided strictly by a single variable, the presence of a baby's hunger cues, sucking sounds, hands moving toward mouth, slight whimpering or crying. The hunger cue is considered a variable because feeding times are random and unpredictable. For example, 3 hours may pass between feedings, then 1 hour, followed by 20 minutes, then 4 hours. It might also be clusters of feeding, which, if you've ever dealt with that, is extremely painful, such as 5 short nursing periods in 3 hours, followed by a long stretch of no feedings. Either way, the time between feedings is not considered important because the theory insists that parents submit to any cues that looks like hunger regardless of the lapse of time. Parent-directed feeding. Both the variable of the hunger cue and the constant of time are viewed as necessary tools of assessment. The conflict between the variable and constant. The greatest tension with feeding philosophy centers on which feeding indicator to use, the variable of the hunger cue or the constant of the clock. The standard attachment parenting La Leche League doctrine insists on child-led feedings exclusively. Therefore, the hunger cue is always dominant. Parents who believe in hyperscheduling see the fixed segments of time as the final determinant of feeding. Thus, the clock is dominant. The weaknesses, the logic of these two views becomes obvious when placed into their respective equation. The child-led equation looks like this. Hunger cue plus nothing equals feeding time. Plus nothing in this equation means there are no factors considered that determine when the baby is fed, except hunger or crying cues of the infant. While this seems to initially make sense, there are some concerns related to this particular approach to the infant. Weakness in practice. Child-led feeding is based on the faulty assumption that the hunger cue is always reliable. It is not, and that is the primary reason this approach is dangerous. Being guided by the hunger cue only works if a hunger cue, such as crying, is present. Weak, sickly, sluggish, or sleepy babies may not signal for food for 5 or 6 hours. Thus, this type of feeding puts the baby at risk of not receiving proper nourishment. If the cue is not present, her baby does not get fed. Exclusive cue response feeding can easily lead to infant dehydration, low weight gain, failure to thrive, and frustration for both baby and mom. If the hunger cue is consistently less than 2 hours, it leads to maternal fatigue. Fatigue is recognized as the number one reason mothers give up breastfeeding. They are exhausted. Man, I remember feeling like I was being drained, literally. Number 4, the erratic nature of cluster feeding produces unintended consequences, including excessive fussiness, erratic nap behavior, and instability in sleep-wake cycles, all contributing to infant sleep deprivation. The clock feeding equation looks like this. Clock plus nothing equals feeding time. Plus nothing in this equation means nothing but the clock determines when the baby is to be fed. The weakness in this practice is, number 1, feeding based on fixed times ignores legitimate hunger cues by assuming each previous feeding was successful. It does not take into account the growth spurts which necessitate a day or more of increased feedings. The baby who shows signs of hunger after 2 hours is put off until the next scheduled feeding, and that extra hour usually comes with crying that could have been avoided. Number 2, strict schedules may not promote sufficient stimulation for breast milk production, leading to the second greatest cause of mothers giving up breastfeeding, low milk supply. With both child-led feeding and clock feeding, a tension exists between the variable and the constant. The tension is both philosophical and physiological. In either case, as parents are trying to serve their underlying parenting philosophy, they become enslaved to a method. To accept either of these feeding indicators as an exclusive guide to feeding is to ensure that a stress-filled and perhaps unhealthy infant. The Babywise philosophy of parent-directed feeding, or PDF, eliminates the tension of relying exclusively on the unreliable variable of a hunger cue or the insufficient constant of the clock. With PDF, both the variable and the constant are used as companions, backups to each other, not antagonists to be avoided. Consider the PDF equation with the inclusion of parental assessment. Hunger cue plus clock plus parental assessment equals feeding time. With the parent-directed approach, you feed your baby when he is hungry, but the clock provides the protective limit so you're not feeding too often, such as every hour, or too little, such as every 4 to 5 hours. PDF brings into play the critical tool of parental assessment. I live in Florida, so never mind the birds. I do apologize. Parental assessment frees the mother to use the variable of the hunger cue when necessary and the constant of time when appropriate. Here are some of the benefits of the PDF approach. Number 1, PDF guided by parental assessment provides tools to recognize and assess 2 potential problems with infant feeding. Sub A is the breastfed child who feeds often, such as every hour, may not be receiving adequate nutrition. Using parental assessment, parents not only respond to the cue by feeding the baby, but are alerted to a potential problem with the feedings. Sub B, when the hunger cue is not present, the clock serves as a guide to ensure that too much or too little time does not lapse between feedings. It is also a protective backup for weak and sickly babies who may not be able to cry effectively. When the hunger cue is present, the clock is submissive to the cue because hunger, not the clock, determines feedings. When parental assessment is part of the equation, parents are protected from moving to the extremes of feeding. PDF and infant attachment. Beyond the assessment tools, the Babywise principles also facilitate parent-child attachment. This is achieved by creating an orderly environment where growth and development are optimized. The fact that a baby's biological and neurological needs are rhythmical, merging with baby's natural capacities, means nothing is hindering the upward progress toward comprehensive attachment. Quote-unquote comprehensive refers to the total spectrum of growth and development as measured by an infant's attainment of his or her developmental capacities. Infants who fail to attain these basic capacities within the first 6 months of life often become underachievers in other developmental prerequisites, leading to healthy relational attachment. And here's why. Babies are born with 7 capacities that, when met, provide objective markers confirming comprehensive attachment is being achieved. The markers include babies who, 1, synchronize their feed-wake cycles. 1. synchronize their feed-wake-sleep cycles into predictable patterns. 2, can fall asleep without a rocking or nursing prop. Number 3, sleep through the night 8 to 10 consecutive hours. 4, have a predictable nap routine. 5, have content wake-up times and adapt to self-play. 6, are able to self-soothe. 7, find comfort with other caregivers, specifically fathers, siblings, and grandparents. The progressive achievement of each attachment marker during the critical first 6 months of life are leading indicators that baby is not in a constant state of stress or anxiousness. In contrast, attachment anxiety is often found in the 12, 18-month, or 2-year-old who is not sleeping through the night, not taking regular naps, unable to self-soothe, is anxious when left alone, or not adept at self-play for sustained periods. These are stress indicators associated with the underdeveloped capacities and reveal that attachment deficits exist. Fortunately, there is an alternative. Babywise helps infants match attachment needs with capacities for a true comprehensive attachment experience. For more on Babywise attachment, visit our resource page at www.babywise.life. That concludes the chapter 2. I am going to now dive into my thoughts and objective opinions on this chapter. So here we go. Final thoughts. This chapter was filled with feeding methods and formulas, literally. I felt like I was just repeating myself at times. One must consider the context as a soon-to-be parent dives into this type of book. It gives several options and equally encourages that each one should be tailored to suit the needs of the child nutritionally. So while I understand some may not agree to each one of these in its entirety, I think it's relevant to note a combination of all methods is typically what ends up being used. So this looks different for each family and child, but ultimately the root issue is always addressed, and that's hunger. The initial quote I want to take a moment to look at is the quote that said, "Every decision made and every action taken as a result of our personal beliefs and assumptions sets in motion rippling effects of corresponding outcomes. Those outcomes are tied to the nature of our own beliefs." So let's think about that for a minute. Many want to state they aren't quote-unquote damaged or that they have healed themselves. Yet, if full transparency and honesty were considered, it would be boldly evident that the decisions we make are guided by the experiences we, as parents, have endured or theories that we have chosen to attach to. And this includes subscribers and people commenting and things like that. Everyone is going to share their opinion coming with the knowledge and the experiences that they've had in their own personal life. So we really have to be mindful of that in the comments, especially when we're disagreeing. So this can make every quote-unquote good thing turn bad. Consider the mother who grew up poor and then she has children, but she feeds them all the time. There's no boundaries and no limitations. And those children grow up to be these 8-year-old obese children with cardiac issues. It's good she can provide food. However, without proper nutritional guidelines, food alone can turn toxic. Same can be said for a baby that is never taught boundaries. The ultimate argument is, at what age do you begin teaching children these things? You know, the big D word, discipline. When the socially accepted response is always, and guys, it's ridiculous in society today, because the excuse is always, he or she is just a kid. Well, legally, they are children until they turn 18 years old. But then what? By the time they are 18, they are considered adults in the eyes of the law. So then a parent gets blamed when the adult messes up or commits a crime. Yet if you tell a child no, and they get upset, then somehow you're being mean and labeled abusive. This makes me think of the loud controversy surrounding Nutgate. I've mentioned before in the video where I covered it more in detail that I believe Nutgate was indeed much bigger than just the ice cream. And ultimately, it set the stage for a Hail Mary from Shanann to secure her marriage and her family. but ultimately did not work out for her. So let's take into consideration the heat that Miss Cindy has taken when it comes to her comment to Cece, telling her that I believe she told Shania that Cece needed to learn that she can't always have what she wants, or she can't always have what other people have. And why in the world is this even an issue? I mean, this comment got blown out of proportion, but why is it even an issue? Cece is old enough to understand the word no, and she had her own ice cream in the freezer that Shanann went with Cindy and picked out. So, for those who do not know, Cindy Watts originally went to the grocery store, bought all kinds of stuff because she knew her grandchildren were coming over. Shanann gets there and says, hey, she's allergic to these things. We can't use these, so we got to go shopping. So Cindy literally trashes everything that she went and bought and takes Shanann with her, and they go grocery shopping, and Shanann picks out the stuff that Cece can have. So this is not some mean grandma that has her grandchildren at the house and she's telling Cece no and gonna let the other grandchild eat the ice cream in front of her. She just couldn't, Cece just couldn't have the ice cream that her cousin had. And we see in the Mother's Day video that Shanann posts that when Cece didn't get what she wanted, she threw herself down and had a tantrum. So what makes anyone think that this would not be the same behavior after being told no in North Carolina? And guys, if you've raised children, if you've been around children, you know you can have an entire box of crayons and they can all be blue. And if one kid has one blue and you try to take the same blue crayon or, the same color out of the box and give to the crying baby, if that baby's never going to be okay with that secondary crayon. They want the one that the other kid has, and that's the end of it. And if they can't have that blue crayon, then they're going to absolutely throw down in the floor. Now, the issue with this is that child has learned that if I kick, scream, cry, then someone's going to come to my rescue. And some would argue, okay, that child feels safe, but others would argue that child knows no boundaries. And no means no. So we want to tell our boys all the time that no means no. Well, are you teaching it at a young age? And so let's get back to Cece with the ice cream. So respectfully, you can raise your children to be little demanding, undisciplined brats. And yes, that's what I call them. However, I will also respectfully ask that you take your little brat home if you expect the whole house to cater to the demands of a toddler. That's just my opinion. If you were to come over, you're more than welcome to bring your children. I love children. But if they walk in that door and it is constant, just demand this, demand that, demand this, demand that, and every time they're told no, they're throwing themselves down on the floor, kicking and screaming, and you do absolutely nothing about it, my sister will tell you. I literally will say, listen, I love you. You're more than welcome to be here, but you need to either handle your child or you need to take her outside. Because there's just, in my opinion, there is no excuse for a toddler to be absolutely demanding and running the show when it's not a basic need that needs to be met. There's a huge difference between a 3-year-old saying, may I please have a cup? Or may I please have something to drink? Depending on their vocabulary level. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a child wanting, a snack. They can have that. But just because they get told no and they want to raise absolute hell over that just to get their way, no ma'am. Absolutely not. And I would really hope that some of you, if not all of you, would have that boundary, not only for yourself in your own household, but for those that you love and the children that you're raising. So no one, especially with children around, wants to have the rippling effect of one child throwing a tantrum and then the next and so on. So in my opinion, this is truly what Cindy was trying to express to Shanann. It had nothing to do with like, oh, Cece wasn't going to get the ice cream. Or anything like that. It was just that Cece had been told that she could not have the ice cream that her cousin had. And so Cece started showing her tail. And guys, we have to keep in mind, she's a flippin' toddler. You know, she was a toddler. It's normal for them to act like that. What's not normal is a parent to completely come unhinged and blow up over their child being told no. But I do go into detail respectfully, you know, with all due respect to Shanann, as to why I believe she really just, that was the last nerve for her. In my opinion, Shanann found out and discovered that Cindy and Ronnie, because they've said they knew he was having an emotional affair. And I believe that Shanann, at some point during her stay, kind of put the pieces together that they knew there was someone else. And so I don't really think Nutgate had anything to do with the ice cream or the nut, you know, the nuts or anything like that. Because we have to keep in mind, Frankie Jr. had the same exact nuts in his bedroom in a bag, and when she got there, she just asked him to put that up. You know, I mean, she did say, what the hell, Frankie, or something to that effect. And Frankie said that, you know, he put them up. And he apologized, and that was the end of it. There was no massive blow-up argument over it. And so I really do think you have to take into full context that entire summer. So, getting back to this, the simple response could have just as easily come from Shanann telling Cece that she could have her ice cream, but not the one with nuts. And that was the end of it. If Cece proceeded to throw a fit, then as a mom, I frankly would have put the ice cream back in the freezer. She would have done without, and if she wanted to fuss about it, she could have gone to the bedroom until she was ready to stop. There's a difference between a need and a want. A child does not need ice cream. It's a want. Society could really benefit from remembering this. If our beliefs and assumptions shape our outcomes, then it very well rolls right into our children as we decide how to best parent them. Most individuals want to be better than their parents, and so it usually deviates from the blueprint of their personal lives and interchanges with the new information often learned through reading or parenting methods. So I do believe that Shanann read the book. I also believe she used it accordingly. And it's not to say that there weren't days where she adapted their routines to suit other outings or schedules. Most parents do this. It's quite similar to anyone trying to work a diet and slowly deviating from it to suit a particular social event. If you do it enough, eventually your diet is no longer your diet, and then you have to start all over. Even the best laid plans change. In this case is a prime example. I mentioned the book by Dr. Spock from the 80s and wanted to share with you that the main character on Look Who's Talking lived by that book in the movie. It's an interesting dynamic because as a first-time single, educated, and professional mother, Molly wants to give her baby the best life possible. She resorts to the book by Dr. Spock, and in one of the scenes, her less educated boyfriend and taxi driver, James, she discusses with him, she's very tired and exhausted, and she's, James says, well, who keeps saying all these things? And she says, all these doctors, and James says, well, all these doctors, they want to sell a book and then they write a book. And then she argues, Dr. Spock doesn't just want to write a book, he loves children. And it's an interesting scene because you can tell how stressed and exacerbated she is, and she really just needs to rest. And through this conversation, eventually she lays down and falls asleep, and then Molly is completely wiped out, and James takes the baby out on the town for some errands, and it's hilarious. I mean, it's a great movie if you've never seen it. It's John Travolta and Kirstie Alley in the movie Look Who's Talking. And this, in my opinion, it touches on the very things mentioned in the comments of this last video, because women have been working professionals more and more since the 80s. That isn't new. We've had demanding jobs. That's nothing new. Divorces happen. That's nothing new. Yes, we have cell phones glued to our hands and heads, but guys, it's still a choice. It's an ignorant and often selfish choice that parents continue to make that ultimately prioritizes work and social lives over the responsibilities required when caring for their families. And yes, I said both ignorant and selfish. Ignorant in the law states if you aren't being compensated for your time, it's illegal to require you to work. So it's important for you to understand your rights and your protections by the law as an employee, because if you don't put management respectfully in their place as far as trying to work you when they're not paying for you, or stressing you out, or making you feel out of fear that you're going to lose your job, those are things that they can and can't do. But if you know your rights, then you're able to stand up for yourself. And therefore, if you are off the clock and unable to answer your phone right away, there's this beautiful thing called a voicemail. And guess what, guys? You can return those phone calls at your convenience. Jobs bullying employees into feeling like they will miss out on an opportunity if they don't answer is a test as old as time. And the ultimate question should be to the individual: what matters more at the moment? Given each moment and situation is different, you have to make a choice. At the end of the day, it's still very much a choice. So in conclusion for this video, I do want to address that issue and head on, and I'll leave you with this. Nothing that is for you is going to come out of manipulation and fear tactics. Know your rights. Respectfully stand your ground. Prioritize accordingly and adjust as needed. This book is not outdated in my opinion. Society's priorities have become so scattered. Remember, it's not illegal to not have a cell phone. It's not illegal to not answer your phone. It's not illegal to not respond to a text message. It's not illegal to not post things to social media. Society has strongly armed the belief that we must be reachable 100% of the time, and that's simply not reality. Tip of the series from the House Huddle: schedule a block of time out of your day to respond to text, emails, calls, etc. Then focus on what's in front of you and work on your priority list. It's okay to revise it accordingly. Until next time.